Welcome, everyone, to our next webinar in the series, Resources for Interpreters, hosted by Cross Cultural Communications. I am Marjorie Bancroft. I am the founder and director of CCC. This is our fifth series of webinars since we began early on in COVID as a free resource for interpreters. This particular webinar is rather a special one. We are the only national training agency for community interpreting and medical interpreting. And one of the topics that comes up often is this question of how you interpret for children. This webinar is about more than just interpreting for children. It's interpreting for unaccompanied minors, which is a really tricky and delicate area of interpreting. So we have the great fortune of having with us Dr. Indira. Oh, I forgot to ask how you pronounce your last name. I always call you Indira Sultanic. How do you say it?
Yes, Sultanic.
Sultanic. I can't believe I forgot to ask that. I want to say that this is someone you can trust with the information she is about to share with you, not only because she has a PhD from Kent State University, not only because she is a professor herself, but we have seen the diligence in which she pours into her research. We've known her for years. She's been a volunteer on a project that was dear to my heart, the Voice of Love project, about interpreting for survivors of torture, war, trauma, and sexual violence. So without further ado, I want to leave you in the excellent hands of Indira, who is about to introduce you to the mysterious and very complicated world, not of interpreting for children in general, but interpreting for unaccompanied minors. She will explain exactly who they are and what that means. Enjoy a very special presentation. Thank you, Indira.
Thank you so much, Marjorie, for this wonderful introduction, and welcome everybody. As Marjorie said, my name is Indira Sultanic. I am an assistant professor in the School of World Studies. I teach translation and interpreting studies, and I also do research in interpreting studies as well as translation and interpreting pedagogy. I'm also a healthcare certified interpreter through CCHI. My working languages are Spanish, Bosnian, Serbian, Croatian, and I'm originally from Bosnia. So I love seeing all of these greetings from different parts of the world. And I must say, I'm just really amazed and just so grateful and thankful and also humbled by the amount of participants. So thank you for being here with me today. I certainly have been mentored by Marjorie, so this is sort of, presenting information that Marjorie is so familiar with as well. And hopefully I will be able to offer something new or something additional to what is already out there in the literature that has been authored by Marjorie and the likes. So I am certainly, I guess, in the right company. So thank you for allowing me to be here today. Now, I would like to begin by inviting you all to join me by going to mentimeter.com or menti.com and answering a couple of questions. So I would like to hear from you. When you think of children, what words come to mind? So you will go to menti.com and use the code 28259460. So I will give you a couple of seconds to do that. There are 3 words. So in one word, just tell me when you think of children, what words come to mind. There are 3 slots for you to answer this question. Okay, some answers already coming in. Right. Oh, I love seeing these come in. Wow. Vulnerable, innocence, innocent, youth, playful, joy, young, fearful, defenseless, shy. Right. Innocent and vulnerable are holding strong. Wow, look at these. All right. Wow. So innocent, vulnerable, and innocence, which is why we're here today, right? So when we think about children, they are by definition, because of their status as a child, innocent and vulnerable, right? So when we consider interpreting and how we approach these settings, we need to think about vulnerability and innocence. So vulnerable and innocent are the top selections here. Now, I also want you to think about if you have interpreted in these contexts or if you haven't, right? So if you were to interpret, which aspect of interpreting for children would you rate as the most difficult? Would it be emotional? Would it be linguistic? Would it be role boundary, right? So would it be linguistic or perhaps because of the topic itself that you are interpreting? Okay, all right. Emotional is holding strong. All right, well, you can certainly keep answering and rating or providing your ratings for these three, but it looks like emotional seems to be the one that most of you have deemed as the most difficult. Role boundary above linguistic. Okay, all right, wonderful. Well, I will certainly, I would be happy to share these later as they come in. I will save them, but I wanted to go ahead and I'm going to stop sharing that screen and go ahead with my presentation. So thank you for indulging me with that. I think it's really interesting to see what people consider as difficult, and it's typically based on what your experience is or perhaps what you've encountered, right? Or maybe you don't have the necessary training, or perhaps you don't have the experience in these settings, and it's based on what you would perceive as difficult or what you deem as difficult. Now, we'll be talking about interpreting for unaccompanied minors in the US, and in terms of how I structure this presentation, we'll begin by defining what is an unaccompanied child. We'll talk about the background a little bit, about the process itself in the United States, immigration or mostly asylum process in the US, and how does this then influence where we fit in as interpreters in this particular area or this specialty, right? We'll talk about the challenges of interpreting for minors. We'll talk about the emotional, linguistic, and role boundary and coping strategies, as well as interpreter training and education. Will kind of end with that. Now, I wanted to also just say that this presentation really comes from research that I've conducted on interpreter-based sort of, or interpreter observed challenges. So they're sort of self-reported challenges and strategies that interpreters have developed. Some may have been sort of just intuitive, and some that were taught. And as all of you probably know, or most of you know, when it comes to training for interpreting for this particularly vulnerable group, there are hit or misses, and a lot of the trainings come from organizations that are serving unaccompanied minors or working with children, right? So whether it's organizations like KIND or the pro bono organizations that work with pro bono attorneys oftentimes have some minimal trainings, but a lot of the training is really kind of encompassed under general training for trauma-informed interpreting, right? So we'll explore these topics. So by the time of this presentation is over, I hope that you leave here having identified the main challenges of interpreting for unaccompanied minors in the US, that you'll be able to understand and address the emotional impact of interpreting for often traumatized unaccompanied minors, and that you will be able to apply specific coping strategies during and after an interpreted session, and that you will also have an idea of what education you might need as an interpreter to be able to interpret for this particularly vulnerable group and other vulnerable groups. Now, a fun fact or an interesting fact is that I'm really focusing, or when we talk about unaccompanied minors, most of the conversations, especially at the US-Mexico border, started kind of in the 2013, right? So according to UNICEF, between 2013 and 2014, a total of 68,400 unaccompanied migrant children crossed the border between Mexico and the United States. So what happens to the children once they cross the border, right? Well, the unaccompanied child status, and if we want to define it, right? An unaccompanied child is known, or also known as an unaccompanied alien child, according to the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, is an individual who has no lawful immigration status in the U.S., is under 18 years of age, has no parent or legal guardian in the United States, or no parent or legal guardian in the United States is available to provide care and physical custody. So then what happens to them once they've crossed the border, right? So upon crossing the border, children are first apprehended and processed by the Customs and Border Patrol, or CBP, and then they're put into temporary holds. And this is according to the Congressional Research Report. Now they are, from there on, referred to the Federal Office of Refugee Resettlement. Now at the Office of Refugee Resettlement, they are provided with pro bono legal representation and interpreters. And interpreters, in addition to working with advocates, work closely with legal representatives and attorneys at different stages of the asylum process. So not just once they've crossed the border and they are in the office of ORR, they are also working with them at different stages of the process. And according to the Congressional Research Service report, in 2020 and 2021 combined, a total of almost 143,000 UCs crossed the border between US and Mexico. Now, before we can begin talking about the challenges of interpreting for unaccompanied minors in the US and the coping strategies, it's also important to understand how one obtains asylum in the US and the different stages during which interpreters may be present. Now, in the US, eligibility for asylum is determined based on the credible fear interview, or CFI, which is conducted by the Customs Border Patrol officers at the port of entry, during which an individual must demonstrate fear of returning to their home country. And Wallace and Hernandez in 2017, as well as Kilman in 2020, have written about this extensively. Now, asylum is granted in two ways, right? So we have the affirmative process by submitting Form I-589, application for asylum and for withholding of removal, and the defensive process, which is a defense against removal from the United States, and it is available only to individuals who are already in removal proceedings in immigration court with the Executive Office for Immigration Review. Before they are transferred to ORR, unaccompanied minors are subject to the CFI. Now, according to USCIS, the interviewing of minors by the Customs and Border Patrol officers is conducted following child-appropriate interview techniques set forth in the guidelines for children's asylum claims. And in these interviews, the asylum officer considers, or they're supposed to consider, child's age, stage of language development, background, and level of sophistication. And this is according to the document issued by the USCIS. Now, according to the American Immigration Council, the client's testimony is usually founded on the credible fear interview, as I already said, or the credible fear or the reasonable fear interview, or a fear of persecution in the country of origin. And regardless of whether one is seeking asylum through the affirmative or the defensive process, right, the story gathering, which also becomes the client's testimony, is the most important piece in an asylum case. So it is extremely important that we uphold the accuracy of that narrative as interpreters who work in these settings. But when the asylum-seeking individual is a minor, right, often with a limited lexicon, who has witnessed and experienced unimaginable tragedy and violence in their home country, and on their journey to safety, it can be really difficult to gather their story, even when an interpreter is present. But we know that without interpreters, right, miscommunication is more likely to occur and result in repatriation, and it can also be what Paul Baer has called tantamount to a death sentence for an asylum seeker. So what are some of the factors, right, that actually can impact story gathering when working with a minor? So I have sort of categorized them into trauma and age. Now, their trauma alone can make it difficult to recount the events of what happened to them in detail, but when that is combined with their age, communication skills, general stress and anxiety of being questioned by an immigration officer, usually in the company of an unfamiliar individual or other unfamiliar individuals such as the interpreter, when they're present in the room, right, the situation is exacerbated. And they're therefore unable to answer questions posed and provide clarification using language, right, that is not adjusted for them. And in some cases, the child is a speaker of an indigenous language with limited or no knowledge of Spanish, yet interpreting is provided only in Spanish. Now, this is actually corroborated by several participants in the study that I conducted, where the participants felt that the challenge wasn't just the terminology or the linguistic, right? It was actually the fact that they were in a setting where they were not able to advocate and request that the child be given given an interpreter in the language that they understand, even though they may have been of an age that they were able to answer questions had they had that opportunity. Now, before we begin discussing the impact of trauma and interpreting challenges, as reported by some of the interpreters as well as what's been seen in existing literature, I wanted to just kind of go through some of the frequent contexts in which interpreters find themselves, and some of you may have found yourselves when interpreting for children or vulnerable populations. So a lot of these are reported by interpreters in the study itself, but in terms of the context, interpretive context, when it comes to immigration or the asylum process, we have the asylum interviews, which are done in person and over the phone, and they're done for immigration officers and child refugees in asylum offices typically. There is immigration attorney and client meetings, right? So these are in the asylum applications, declarations, story gathering phase. There's detention centers, that's interpreting usually done over the phone or in person. Recently, obviously, more over the phone with immigration officers and the refugee children. We have immigration court, we have state courts, there's special immigration juvenile status hearings, there are social services, there's shelters, US-Mexico border authorities, and also or their offices, and also inpatient mental health settings, right? So when we think about the different stages of their process, right, we can encounter children who require different services, and therefore how we approach the actual interpreting might vary based on the context. So it's also important to just kind of keep this in the back of our minds as well as we are thinking, how do I situate myself? How do I act in this particular context as an interpreter? So there are some considerations for interpreters, right? And Nielsen has talked about child participation in the interview, which is dependent primarily on his or her or their understanding and acceptance of the system of turn-taking that is fundamental to consecutive interpretation. Now, it has been documented by several studies in Sweden or in Europe in general that the children's participation in interpreter-mediated interview may also depend on whether the interviewer or the interpreter finds their asylum claim credible, right? So again, going back to that, who is present in the room and trusting or being fearful or not answering questions because they do not know the individuals that they are surrounded by, even when there is an interpreter present. So these are some important considerations, but I think the turn-taking piece is especially important when we consider age or when we consider the context and what how we operate, right? If we've been given an opportunity to do a proper introduction, how the children have been treated, right? So, or if they've been explained what our role is, and if they're able to then understand, right? Of course, age being a factor, right? But if they're able to then kind of, if we're able to build rapport, right? Without overstepping or without crossing any boundary as professionals in this context. So what is then the impact of exposure to traumatic content on the interpreters? Now, we know, and you probably know, that interpreters are the first to hear stories and narratives with traumatic content, which can have both immediate and long-term adverse effects. And this has been also shown in a lot of research studies conducted on how exposure to traumatic content and traumatic narratives impacts interpreters. And many interpreters also have a history of their own trauma or a lived experience, or perhaps they come from the same country as the unaccompanied minor they're interpreting for. And there is also the use of first person while interpreting traumatic content, all of which can lead to distress or re-traumatization. Annika Krzyzewski has written on this topic as well, right? So it's just considering all of these different factors that we have to, and layers that, right, we have to sort of peel back to understand what it is that we do, how we do it, and how do we then navigate these spaces where there is not just exposure to traumatic content, but our own background experiences and our own trauma and our own biases. So there are several layers that we have to kind of peel back, or several things that we need to unpack prior to going into these settings. Now, there are obviously, I wanted to kind of bring up some of these traumatic or effects of exposure, right? So to traumatic narratives, right? that were reported by interpreters themselves, right? So due to the story and lack of empathy, right, from an officer, one interpreter reported that, hearing that the child, were mistreated when they were in immigration detention or the safe house, was very much impacting them negatively, right, during an interpreted account. Also due to clients being questioned in a language they did not understand, and due to their own personal experiences. Now, most of the participants really kind of reported during the interpreted event, right, or during their interpreted session, the effects of exposure was really kind of leading to sadness or feelings of sadness, or feeling like it was hitting close to home. Again, going back to these past experiences, some were experiencing feelings of anger at the situation or how they were being treated, or the U.S. immigration system, or just the fact that there is criminalization, right, of asylum seekers and refugees and immigrants. There's also these feelings of disgust at, again, the treatment and how people were being treated, or where they were being held, or the conditions, and just simply the fact that they were not being given interpreters or proper access to services because there was a lack of interpreters, or sometimes even delay in getting them proper representation. Some interpreters reported during an interpreted assignment, right, feeling choked up or getting choked up at the content that they were, or the narratives that they were hearing, and then having to interpret that after internalizing it. And then after the interpreted assignment, a lot of participants felt anger, or they expressed feelings of anger. Some felt that they found themselves crying on and off. Some were sort of lingering effects where they found themselves crying a couple of days later. Some experienced nightmares, and sometimes also having nightmares because there was a likeness of the child they were interpreting for to their own child or their own family member. So there was some of those things that kind of found themselves into the subconsciousness, or the nightmares, or sort of the, if you will, psyche of a lot of the people working in these contexts. Now, some felt triggered by stuff afterwards, and some also felt that they were a little less trusting of individuals because of the things that they were hearing and the narratives that they were witnessing. And now for many participants, the after effects seemed minimal, lingering only for a day, right? So some reported sort of experiencing sadness or anger or some of these effects for longer periods of time, but some of them just felt, after they were done with the interpreted assignment, they were able to kind of decompress and release it, and found ways to cope and move on to the next assignment. And sometimes even just the fact of moving on to the next story made them sort of let go of the previous experience that they witnessed. And some, obviously had it lingering for a day. Others, the interpreted event had a negative impact on their personal lives as well, sort of, again, going back to this being triggered and having sort of these very little disagreements lead to big explosions and with their significant others, or with in their family lives, and cause disruptions, negative disruptions. Now, in terms of the effects of exposure to traumatic narrative, I wanted to also bring up these positive effects of exposure, or if you will, positive because I have classified them as such, primarily because what I found in these studies is that interpreters felt that because of having witnessed or having heard these narratives, or having sort of interpreted for unaccompanied children who have experienced trauma or sort of significant hardships, right? They felt more sympathetic. They felt more aware of other people's situations. They said that it was very eye-opening, and that they felt more human, right? That it was in a way a reality check for them as well, right? And a lot of them found themselves in reporting this sort of positive effect of exposure. And that's not to say that they didn't also report that it affected them negatively, but they wanted to highlight that it was positively impacting them as well, because they wanted to be more helpful. They wanted to really contribute more. They wanted to learn more. And they found themselves, in preparing to engage further in these interpreted events, really kind of going to learn more about the background stories, and learning more about the even geographical locations and the history of some of these places that the children were coming from, to be able to have a better sense of not just the terminology, but to be able to visualize sort of the conditions, right? And I think recently, there was a recent webinar, I believe by Robin Reagan, if I'm not mistaken, in which she was talking about, and even in her article in the ATA Chronicle, she talks about, some of the challenges being, right, like knowing the context and knowing where they're coming from and knowing the terminology, best terminology to describe these places, right? Because all of that is really important. These details are important. So a lot of the participants also spoke to that, like making them more sympathetic, more aware, sort of more human, but also more interested in learning more and kind of pursuing or finding themselves sort of being interested and going to look for additional content and information that could help them be better interpreters and to better serve the population that they were working with. Now, some of the challenges of interpreting children's narratives that were reported, and I have classified these, and you also have participated in the poll, were emotional, linguistics, and role boundary. Now, these have been classified sort of in these broad terms because I wanted to make sure that we were able to kind of differentiate also for the purpose of the context or situating our own practice depending on, right, the different stage of the asylum process and how sometimes based on the actual sort of parameters under which we are working, how these might shift as well, right? How we perhaps might have more emotional challenges or more linguistic challenges or more challenges with role boundary, right? So, and if you are an interpreter who is a court interpreter, or if you're a certified interpreter, or if whatever training you might have, I think the role boundary is sort of something that is sometimes often perceived as more rigid when it comes to legal interpreting than perhaps community or public service interpreting settings that are outside of the courtroom itself. So when it comes to emotional challenges, some of the most commonly reported ones in literature and by the participants really have to do with the child's emotions, interpreter's emotions, and perception of emotion, right? So child's emotions, right? When the child starts to cry, how do you navigate that? How do you sort of approach that as a deeply feeling human, right? There's also the interpreter's emotion. How do you manage your own emotions and reaction to a child's emotion? There's also the perception of emotion, which this was an interesting one because, there were interpreters who talked about sort of how they felt the child or what they thought the child was feeling in the moment, despite sort of having any evidence. It was their own sort of assessment or bias, even in some cases, that perhaps the child wasn't emoting because it's cultural or whatever it might be, right? So there was a different sort of piece to this as well, where there was a perception of emotion, right? And we think about emotion and cultural background and people not wanting it to be a burden sometimes. So depending on the age of the child, right, the perception of emotion was sometimes interesting to see from the interpreter's perspective. And there is also, of course, the emotional burden that's placed on the interpreter a lot of the times. And this is particularly important to acknowledge because it's been discussed, right, in this interpreting circles that there is very little support or lack of support for mental health for interpreters, for example, right? We're now seeing more of these conversations take place. But again, the emotional burden really that's placed on the interpreter is great. And oftentimes there aren't proper avenues or channels for interpreters to kind of cope with that. So some of the linguistic challenges that were reported, right? We have the language level or the language level of the child and their ability to communicate what has happened to them using the right words. And the linguistic challenges, again, was the age of the child, going back to sort of, if they're able to, what is their stage of language development, right? How, can they communicate? Do they have the words to communicate? And then also the interpreter's knowledge of the right terminology and consequently their ability to retell the story accurately. Again, going back to the most important piece being the story gathering, right? And this narrative really being accurate. And I don't mean this in sort of the essentialist terms, accuracy, when we talk about things being complete and accurate, right? It's kind of referencing again what I believe Reagan was talking about, Robin Reagan, when she was talking about, this background knowledge and this information and being able to really kind of adequately and appropriately and correctly describe the living conditions, right? And how does that, our narration of their narrative or interpretation of their narrative, how does that impact the accuracy of the story and subsequently, right, the success of their asylum case or asylum application? With regards to role boundary, it is really of note that in my study itself, though difficult, all interpreters reported that they were able to remain within their role of interpreter, right? The primary role, right? And again, like I don't want to get into essentialist terminology, but I think people really kind of see communication as their primary role, right? And even those who reported that they were not formally trained also reported that they were able to really kind of stick to interpreting. Now, whether that was, and that's whether that was because they wanted to keep the conversation going and keep interpreting so as not to fall apart, or to really truly take on and feel the emotions that they really were feeling, whether it was because they were suppressing the emotions or because they really wanted to make sure that the story was told, right? So sort of even without being properly trained or without having been trained on how to interpret, they recognize the importance of this story and the story gathering and having to retell that in the most correct, accurate way possible, right? Without letting your emotions take over, because ultimately it was not about you as the interpreter. Now, one study participant reported when it comes to staying within the role, they said that, I would say that it's hard to, just ask the questions, just to be there as a bystander. I think it's hard. I know that the attorneys are helping, but if the child doesn't want to answer some questions and you're there and you're trying to help, you're not supposed to try to help, but you are. You want to make a good case for this kid. If this kid doesn't make a good case in court, he's going to go right back to where he came from and he's going to get deported. And you don't want that. And I guess I guess the attorneys don't want that. So it's sort of suggesting, right, that it's the difficulty of just being a bystander and wanting to help, but ultimately you can't interpret what you don't hear and you can't infer meaning from something that isn't being spoken, right? But then again, it goes back to the age of the child, looking at the trauma itself, right? Is there a lack of sort of verbal response because of their experience and the trauma that they've gone through? Or is it because they don't have the words? Or is it because they are not trusting the individuals, right? There's so many different layers to this that are really complicated. Now we go to the coping strategies, right? So when it comes to the coping strategies, I classify them and I like to think of them as coping strategies that we use during the interpreted event, so i.e. following the interpreted event. And I also wanted to kind of mention some of the examples of the absence of coping strategies, or actually where interpreters felt that they didn't have any coping strategies, where in fact what they reported were coping strategies that they used, but they just were never told that these in fact would count. If you look at the literature, if you look at training content, educational materials used for interpreting for, or trauma-informed interpreting, or interpreting for survivors of trauma or torture or violence of any sort, that these in fact do count as coping strategies. Now, there is also one coping strategies. It's not really a coping strategy that is during or following, but it's one that I think is important, and perhaps it can be classified as that, but I think of it as a coping strategy. It's sort of what happens the pre-interpreted event coping strategy, as in our being informed, being briefed, being given information ahead of time so that we have the ability to then sort of preemptively prepare, right? So then we know exactly what we're walking into. We know exactly what kind of mechanisms we need to employ during the event then to be able to cope with the content that we are exposed to. Now, when we're interpreting, one participant said, when we're interpreting, we stop being ourselves. We become kind of like an actor or an actress. Now, I initially framed this project, or a part of this presentation where it comes from my research, and that project was really kind of using the emotional labor framework, right? Because interpreting for vulnerable populations is, interpreting in general in most settings is emotional labor, right? So I think it is important to recognize also from this example, and I wanted to show it for this reason, is that, sort of being an actor is one of the dimensions that is discussed when we talk about sort of the dimensions of emotional labor that I also used to kind of frame this particular project in discussing coping strategies and how we move through these spaces as interpreters, right? Handling the different events, or handling the stories during, and then handling the content and the weight and the emotional burden that we carry afterwards, or that we may carry afterwards. I just kind of wanted to show that because, again, this came from somebody who had very minimal training, and it was in a medical setting, right? So it was somebody who recognized that they're there to interpret what was said as it said, when it was said, right? So you're actor, you, even though if you do or look at studies on actors, right, there are some that show that you internalize that role sometimes in preparation for it. So even that doesn't fully guarantee that there is going to be this distance from this particular content, right? You might still need some time to sort of recover, to kind of bring yourself out of it, and feel fully back to normal, if you will. I don't know that I don't personally ever feel fully back to normal after these, but just to kind of help those feelings dissipate. Now, when it comes to these sort of coping mechanisms that were reported and that also are extant in literature, during the interpreted event, right, interpreters reported, and sort of the recommended strategies really are to focus on the task at hand. So focusing on the task at hand, holding on to a stress ball or something soft, right, as a way to ground yourself, going into the assignment, focusing on the role as the conduit. And this was, again, somebody who had reported only having training in medical interpreting, or just, sort of having started as an interpreter very recently, right? And then having to remind themselves that the message is not theirs, it's the speaker's, right? So just making sure that they're communicating the message. Taking notes to have something to hold on to, and being in a hypersensitivity mode as the first one to hear the message in their language or in either language. Now, breathing during the assignment, and if you look at any of the trainings by Bancroft, Marjorie herself, right, I think breathing and sort of grounding yourself is very important during the assignment, reminding oneself that one is there to help the children and hoping for a good outcome, right? So those things being important as coping strategies during the encounter, and then shutting oneself off emotionally while interpreting as a form of self-preservation by assuming the role of an actor during the interaction. Again, going back to the actor, right? So trying to shut yourself off and giving it your best, putting your best face forward, sort of like the game face, so as not to feel the full depth of those feelings. Now, following the interpreted assignment or the interpreted event, interpreters reported some of the coping strategies that really helped was talking to someone, whether it's another interpreter, colleague, supervisor, community organizer, or others in the same line of work who understand the work that they do. Now, when it comes to the actual strategies following an interpreted event, this is an interesting one because I felt that in terms of talking to someone, some of the participants that reported this sort of being their go-to really were ones that either had experience working as advocates or had groups that they could go to who also were bound by the confidentiality agreements, right, that a lot of interpreters and a lot of people working with minors have to sign in different contexts, right? So for them, this was sort of what helped is having somebody who understands what they do that they could talk to. Now, applying coping strategies learned and used for coping with personal trauma, right? So some of them even reported using coping strategies that they had learned to cope with what they had been through, such as spending time alone, receiving physical contact and affection from loved ones, guided meditation. Some interpreters reported sleeping, sort of sleeping it off, doing physical exercise, participating in comedy, doing something that's just relieving some of that emotional burden, and then reading also as one following the interpreted event. Some of them reported that what really helped them was undergoing a psychological evaluation for other stressors in their personal life, and this also served as an evaluation for one's emotional state due to exposure to vicarious trauma during interpreting, turning to one's faith and prayer, going to therapy routinely, taking a shower, and visualizing the event sort of just wash away. That was one that was also reported by participants, that just kind of visualizing the letting go of all of the content and the narrative that you just interpreted, right? That you sort of channeled. Now, going on long walks, again, activity alone or with the dog to calm oneself, rewinding the story in one's head, reflecting on the events, processing, and then moving on, right? So kind of sitting down with it, sitting with the emotion and processing it, and then letting go. And then finding refuge at home with family. So these are just some of the most commonly sort of used coping strategies or the mechanisms following an interpretive event that interpreters reported as really effective for them. Again, emotional labor, and when we think about how we respond to traumatic content and narratives, it's very personal, right? So these these answers really corroborate that a lot of participants kind of shared some of these strategies that they employ. Most of them really differed in what was the most, or what they found the most helpful in coping with the traumatic content that they were witnessing in these settings. We will move on to interpreter training and education, and this is sort of the last piece of this presentation, and I think it's extremely important because when we think about the challenges, when we think about the strategies, where do we get all of these strategies, right? How do we cope with the challenges? How do we negotiate our place in these spaces? How do we navigate it? How do we ensure that these narratives are accurate, right? Again, now, we have established by now, right, that asylum interpreting for adults and children alike is a demanding task. So it is a very demanding task, and it is in its essence emotional labor. And now, in addition to that emotional aspect, right, it is complicated by several factors such as setting or the environment, organizational requirements, or lack thereof. We have the mode, modality, the linguistic and cultural background of the interlocutors. And there's also, for us to successfully then manage an interpretive event as interpreters, and I say us because I am also an interpreter, right? And to manage the flow of communication between the different parties, of which one is a minor, right? Training, educational skill, and understanding of the interpreter's role in the interaction, given the setting and the context, right? As well as their ability then to interpret the meaning from the nuances of both verbal and nonverbal communication are paramount. Now, again, like I always like to say, while checking our bias, right? So it's important to think about like the nonverbal aspect of it, and again, thinking about where does our bias as interpreters then fit into this piece of it. And it is a well-known fact, and one that's been argued by Bancroft, right, and Marjorie, and that in the US, as it is the case in other countries, right, interpreting in legal settings outside of the courtroom is still very likely to be performed by interpreters with very little or no training in the field, or by interpreters whose training and experience is focused almost exclusively on non-legal sectors, right, so community, conference, and business interpreting. Now, the findings from the study that I conducted really corroborate this, right? And in that study, there were several participants who had this belief that even a general training on an understanding of trauma can have more specific applications, especially when working in contexts involving minors, right? So what was really interesting is that, as I mentioned earlier, right, even the interpreters who reported not having much training, that they really felt that simply by attending a workshop or simply by attending a webinar like you are right now, and kind of getting a sense of the different sort of aspects of interpreting for minors, thinking about trauma-informed interpreting, how to ground themselves, how to approach it, what are the considerations, they really felt more prepared to go into these contexts, right? And they could then apply that, not generalize it, right, but kind of still use specific components of those trainings to apply to working with minors in these contexts. So what options are currently available in the United States? Well, in the United States, as I'm sure a lot of you probably already know, training and education of interpreters in community or public settings or public service settings is still primarily divided into legal, medical, and educational, which is now sort of a field that's gaining a lot more visibility and professionalization, sort of where we're headed with that, right? Even though it's existed for a long time and there have been professional interpreters in these settings. Though there are some aspects of the professional and ethical principles that do overlap, right? So even though those are sort of the primary categories, there's a lot of ethical principles that overlap, and I think it's really evident from the reported, or from the answers, right, from the participants and what they reported on when it comes to the role boundary, or how they actually kind of move through the different stages, adhering to the role of the interpreter or kind of to the code of ethics and the standards of practice, right, that are outlined in these documents. So I conducted an online survey of interpreting programs, and what I really found and what that survey revealed is that there is a significant shortage of different trainings and educational programs when it comes to this particular group. And it didn't really yield substantial results with regards to specific training for interpreting for refugee children in the US. And asylum interpreting in the US context has not really to date been established as its own area of expertise, but it rather exists, right, as is observed by several scholars, right, under this general umbrella of either legal or community interpreting or at the cross section of the two. And this is in large part due to language policies, thus the trainings for working with refugees and vulnerable populations in the US that do exist, they have sort of been primarily offered through, like I said, organizations for immigrant integration and typically comprise some variation of trauma-informed interpreting. So the most notable programs, and the first one is really a program, the second one is an organization that has different training modules and also works on networks that can connect different providers and different interpreters and language service providers. A program called Breaking Silence, Interpreting for Victim Services, which was developed by Bancroft, Marjorie herself, and several other individuals. It's a project of AYUDA in partnership with the District of Columbia's Office of Victim Services and Justice Grant. And AYUDA provides legal, social, and language services to help low-income immigrants in their neighborhood access justice and transform their lives. And they also have an interpreter bank. So this is one really that is present online in the sort of internet space, if you will. If you're searching on the web, this is what you will come across. Now, the Bridging Refugee Youth and Children's Services, they, like I said, they're an organization that offers a series of workshops for different stakeholders working with minors on how to work with an interpreter, right? How to access a remote interpreter, how to set up a session using proper equipment, etc., right? And troubleshoot technical issues. And they have networks connecting different organizations who work with unaccompanied minors. And prior to Breaking Silence, or to the Breaking Silence curriculum, there was another similar training, and I was lucky enough to participate in this training. It was also developed by Bancroft in 2012, I believe, and it was delivered first as a pilot and then as a recurring training. It was called the Voice of Love, Interpreting Compassion. It was really pioneered by Marjorie Bancroft, and I believe it's since been dissolved, the organization itself, but I still have the manual called Healing Voices, which was extremely instrumental for me and helpful in understanding trauma and trauma-informed interpreting. Again, kind of going back to what was reported by participants, right? When you have this overarching or general training or specific to more adult settings, right, or settings involving adults, it can still be really helpful and useful in understanding trauma and applying it to contexts where you're hearing narratives, traumatic narratives told by children. Now, the question of interest for us then is, what training and education do interpreters need to work in these settings? So what are these trainings and educational modules that we can then go to, and what are the components that we really need to consider, and what is it that we need to understand? So studies have shown that interpreting for vulnerable populations, whether it be groups that fled war and violence or torture or other kinds of trauma and traumatic experience, it takes a toll on the interpreter and then can lead to vicarious trauma and re-traumatization of the interpreters. Now, training, therefore, right, is an education of interpreters working with asylum seekers must be or at the center of these trainings, right, must be the trauma-informed interpreter training, right? And there are several aspects that need to be considered. Now, I'm drawing here on the Interpreting for Victim Services by Bancroft from 2016, in which she specifies, right, what interpreters need to understand. So we have the impact of crime on victims, what trauma is and its impact, vicarious trauma, domestic violence, sexual assault, and child abuse, how basic interpreter skills are used, where it sort of crosses the line into legal interpreting, and they have to be aware of unconscious bias as well, and be emotionally prepared, right? So we talk a lot about emotional fortitude, and I believe Robin Reagan has also addressed this in her article at the ATA Chronicle, where she talks about sort of emotional fortitude and ability to interpret for a long periods of time consecutively, right? But also approaching this with empathy. Now, what else do interpreters need to consider? So, in addition to these suggestions by Bancroft and the emotional strength, some of these aspects were also proposed by Salaitz and Balog in 2019. And this is research coming out of Europe, right? Some of the aspects that need to be considered in training modules when interpreting for unaccompanied children's, and sort of preferences of interpreting mode and ability to know when to switch between different modes, positioning, right, spatial relationships when you're working in person, when you're working remotely, and special adjustments and considerations when you're in remote settings. So the age of the child, language development, understanding of the role, preferences of interpreting mode, preferences of gender, even positioning or spatial relationships when in person, right? Like I said, report building and briefing with all stakeholders prior to the event. Now, report building between the child and the interviewer through an interpreter is really important, according to Salaitz and Balog in their study. Briefing with all stakeholders, right, including introducing the interpreter and their role to the child, right, especially when we think about sort of their participation in the turn taking. And then normalizing an implementation of professional briefing or debriefing, right, between the interviewer and the interpreter as an opportunity for the interpreter to safely process the difficult content, therefore reducing the risk of vicarious traumatization and re-traumatization. And to conclude, and broadly speaking, training and education can be categorized into background information and knowledge, procedural knowledge, including understanding of the interview structure and techniques, interpreting knowledge, terminology knowledge, emotional strength built on trauma-informed training with special strategies learned for coping prior to, in process, and post-assignment, and interprofessional training and collaboration. Although many of the volunteers working in the US-Mexico border or at the US-Mexico border are trained, professional, and often certified interpreters, in addition to the emotional fortitude and ability to perform long consecutive, as it's been argued by Reagan, as the only requirement for an interpreter to be able to do this job, interpreters must also have specialized training in language brokering for children, especially since incorrect information collected during the story gathering process, right, could cost someone their life. Thus, interpreters should be well versed in the language of interviewing of minors, whether it be through training with therapists, advocates, or the forensic interviewing process, to understand how the questions are asked and their purpose in eliciting information. And they must know the difference between closed and open-ended questioning. And these are my references. And with that, I conclude this session. Thank you very much. I will now open it for questions. Marjorie, you have the floor.
Well, I am here. Let me, oops, there we go. I have the Q&A in front of where I start the video. There, I am back. You have a slew of questions, my dear, so I am not going to waste any time and jump right in. Oh goodness, just a second here. So one of the first question, in fact, was hello, Indira, are we going to get a list of the vocabulary, list of explanation of it? Is there, besides the breaking silence is free and on the web, and if you look at Q&A, you can see a link to it. There is a terminology list for victim services, but for this particular topic, Indira, is there anything out there?
I honestly, other than going through the different research that's out there and the definitions, I'm happy to compile some if people have great interest. I don't know that there is a specific, perhaps, index of these terms. I'm not familiar with it, and my apologies, because I was focused more on the research side and the findings than the definitions. But yes, I'm sure that there are a lot of resources. I just don't have them all compiled, but I'm happy to get that started and share. Well,
we certainly have a mailing list of about 15,000, so we can certainly distribute that list for you if you ever develop it. We'll be happy to do that. This is a very specific question. How do you handle it when the minor is less than 5 or 6 years old, in the first person or third person, is the question.
Isn't that always the question? I think I think it depends on the setting, right? So I have when I felt really emotional, or I think just for confusion, right? I think this is the general rule for interpreting for children in general, right? I think reported speech or interpreting in third person is what you normally do to avoid confusion, right? And that's typically what I would do. So third person, and Marjorie can correct me on this, but third person is perfectly acceptable, right? Because the point is to ensure that they're able to understand and respond to the best of their ability, right? So, knowing who you are and knowing who's talking at what time, because it can be really confusing talking in first person, right? Because again, that can then lead away, and you are not you're building rapport, but it's really not about rapport with you. It's rapport with the person that is there to do their job or to do the interview itself. And especially with attorneys, that's been my experience, right? Personally, where I worked was with children and attorneys who were doing some of the questioning and different advocates and different service providers.
Yeah, my understanding, because I'm not a specialist in pediatric interpreting, is that once you get younger than 8 years old, first person can be very, very confusing. So it's simply not necessarily functional,
Right.
depending on the child. Um, this is a little bit of a heartbreaking question. What if the child develops an attachment to the interpreter as being the only native speaker who they can trust?
Oh, that is very difficult. I think that is it is heartbreaking. And I had a case where they had to get a female interpreter. So it was a gender related thing. They wanted a female interpreter because the child wasn't opening up. And I had that happened. And then I had to move. So we had to negotiate and bring in a different person and work on introducing that person and getting them to get comfortable, especially until they identified a relative. I think it's important for them, for the provider or for attorneys or whoever you're working with, to know that you are a professional first and foremost. And children usually know that, right? So even if they are attached to you, they usually know, right, that you are a professional, or that you are sharing information, that you wouldn't withhold information or not communicate anything with them. So as long as you are a professional, right, if everybody knows that you are sharing the information and that you are communicating with everybody, that you're transparent, there is a way to do your job, even with the most heartbreaking piece where somebody is really attached to you as the only person speaking their language. But it is very difficult.
It is. Do you have any information on how often interpreters are actually provided for unaccompanied minors?
I do not have those statistics. And I will say this, I'm working on a separate project right now, and there is this terminology being used about interpreters who work in a lot of these settings where they work pro bono, or it's volunteerism, or it's, I don't want to go into binaries, professional, non-professional, right? But it's non-remunerated individuals,
Yeah.
right? They're sort of in the shadows, right? So they're sort of the hidden population. And I think oftentimes, because of it's a state of emergency, or it's a crisis, or we are sort of the sheer volume of requests, it's, nobody really has the time to keep track of that. And nobody to my knowledge, has done a study. So if anybody has information on that, I would be very interested in knowing how often, because I think that's also called into question, right? There's the reason why there's such a pushback, and why we're doing this and why we are so committed to this work, is because there is a need and they aren't always met.
Yeah, in fact, there's somebody commented early on in the chat that they had personally had to advocate as a Spanish interpreter for indigenous language
Yeah,
speaking
absolutely.
children. So yeah, as you were reporting yourself. One last question, because we're at the very end. I'm sure other people have this question too. They say, I missed the beginning, so sorry if you stated this. Have you published your study? Where can I read it? Thank you for carrying out such important research. That's the question.
Yes. So this particular one is actually it's in the references. So when you receive the PDF, there is selected references and citations that were even recommended readings for you. So it's in there, and it's in the signature of my email. So if you email me, it's isultanic or sultanich@vcu.edu. I'm happy to share it, but it's published under Linguistica and Perpiencia. So you can read that there. But yes, it's in the list of references, and you'll have a direct link to it from there.
Fantastic. We have to let you go now, but I do have one comment I wanted to share. Somebody said that this is a brilliant presentation, and there have been many grateful comments. Very appreciative. This is a totally unusual webinar, even for our series. It's very specialized in area. I didn't even know how attendance would be, and yet there we had 1,000 registrations. It goes to show how deeply needed this was. Sultana, thank you so much for sharing your expertise so generously. Everybody, you will get a link in your email tomorrow, about 24 hours from now, a link to the PowerPoint, which Indira is graciously sharing with you, a link to the recording of this webinar, which will also be posted on our website for others, and a link to your certificate, which has CCHI, ATA, and RID CUs for those of you who are interested in CUs. Once again, Indira, as I mentioned, I tend to stay on afterwards for other questions for CCC, but I want to let you go with really our deepest thanks. I must say that this was the only webinar I presented where I was personally quoted so much, but it's because the subject of interpreting for trauma is the dearest area to me of all areas of community interpreting, and the one where, as you know, I've dedicated a huge percentage of my pro bono life as well. So thank you. It was really gratifying to see that it had been useful to you. I was quite excited about that. So special thanks to you.
No, absolutely. And I just want to say thank you so much. I haven't had a chance to look at all the comments because I was just, wanting to make sure I gave you the information and we maximize the time. And thank you, Marjorie. I mean, you are the pioneer in our field, and you are, who's kind of been lighting the way. And now it's, you're passing the torch and giving us sort of the information to kind of take it further. So I'm really grateful. And of course, when you are the person who's done the most work, you get to be cited. And this was very humbling. And thank you for being a mentor. And thank you, everybody. I hope that there will be many opportunities to engage. And please feel free to email me if you have any questions. Thank you. Have a good day.
Thank you. Have a wonderful day. Rest of your day, Indira. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.